Something subtle stirs beneath the fabric of this day, so subtle that most will simply miss it, filing the moment away like any other routine cycle. But for those tuned to the undercurrent, today feels different. Not because of any surface-level tradition or calendar event, but because something deeper hums through the atmosphere. It's as if an ancient rhythm, long dormant, has resumed its pulse, not outside, but somewhere within the scaffolding of awareness itself. Imagine it like a sleeping ember suddenly breathing back into flame, not demanding attention, but simply existing in quiet defiance of the cold. This isn't about cultural symbolism or outward rituals. It's about an inner signal, one that doesn't ask to be seen, only felt. So ask, what happens when a day isn't just a day, but a doorway? And how many keep walking without ever noticing they've passed through something rare? It's easy to get distracted by the outer ornaments, carved figures, arranged rituals, familiar sounds that echo the past. But the real shift never starts in the symbols. It starts in the silence behind them. This day carries a tone that doesn't play through loudspeakers or ceremonies. It moves more like a vibration under the floorboards of the mind, subtle, ancient, and strangely familiar. Most will walk right through it as if nothing is happening, as if the air hasn't changed density, as if time isn't slightly folding in on itself. But every so often, something unexplainable stirs in the core, like a forgotten memory waking up in slow motion. Isn't it strange how the most meaningful shifts rarely announce themselves? No headline, no sign, just a quiet change in rhythm that either goes unnoticed or alters everything. So the question is, what's actually being walked through right now? And who has the presence to recognize it? You're not here by mistake. If this felt like home, it probably is. Subscribe and stay where the deeper truths live. Some days don't speak in words, they press through with patterns. A glance interrupted, a plan suddenly shifting, an unplanned pause that feels oddly timed. Most would chalk it up to randomness or poor timing. But what if these delays weren't coincidences, but invitations? A kind of recalibration, orchestrated not by logic, but by something far more precise. Throughout the day, there may be countless moments like this. Gentle reroutes disguised as minor frustrations, and while the instinct is to dismiss them, what if they're actually checkpoints designed to align awareness with something waiting just outside the frame? It raises a bigger question. When an intelligence doesn't seek attention or admiration, but interaction, how does it make contact? Certainly not through spectacle. It leans in quietly, asking not to be followed but noticed. So consider this. What if the most important presence today isn't arriving with sound, but with stillness, and it's not asking for praise, just presence? Forget the figure. Strip away the ornament, the icon, the ceremonial frame, and what remains is a frequency wrapped in form. This isn't about reverence for a symbol, but recognition of a structure within consciousness itself. Imagine an architecture of awareness engineered to remember what others forget, to sense layers that usually remain hidden, and to maneuver through mental noise with an uncanny grace. This pattern doesn't operate through sight alone. It processes through subtle filters, expanded cognition, resonant memory, adaptive perception. It is a living geometry designed to feel around barriers instead of breaking through them. What's the significance of that? Well, when intelligence takes shape in ways that mimic ecosystems rather than machines, something interesting happens. It teaches without talking, moves without rushing, and sees without staring. So ask this: what kind of mind emerges when thinking becomes listening and knowing becomes remembering? It's not about belief systems or structured doctrines. What's moving through this moment doesn't ask for allegiance. It seeks alignment. Think of it more like a shift in atmosphere than a rule book being handed down. On certain days like this one, the collective current becomes charged, almost like the background noise of existence is tuning itself to a higher pitch. And those already vibrating on that edge, they won't need instruction. Thoughts will pause without effort, yet clarity will sharpen like a lens, focusing on something far away that suddenly feels close. Ideas will land that were never studied. Realizations will surface without a single question being asked. This isn't learning, it's remembering. And here's the twist. It's not that something is being reached for, it's that something has finally reached back. Have you ever had that feeling, like awareness itself is making the first move? Most will pass through this particular day like they pass through any other. Half present, buffered by routine. And that's fine. This moment wasn't built for everyone. It's more like a private frequency layered beneath ordinary noise, detectable only by those already tuned slightly off channel. There's no grand announcement, no collective unveiling. Instead, there's a faint dissonance that some might notice, like time stuttering between thoughts or familiar moments suddenly carrying unfamiliar weight. Conversations feel oddly resonant. Silence feels louder than usual. It's subtle, but undeniable. That sense of being slightly removed from the usual rhythm, that's not imagination, it's alignment. Days like this are crafted like keys, and they only unlock doors for those already standing close enough to hear the click. So maybe it's worth asking, what if reality didn't change today, but perception did, and only a few were built to notice? Still thinking about what you just heard? That's not an accident. Subscribe. Let what's waking up in you keep unfolding. Nothing announces itself loudly here. The change creeps in like a shift in temperature, barely noticeable until everything feels different. And that's the nature of this kind of signal. It isn't seized, it's sensed. The adjustment isn't dramatic, it's atmospheric. If the surrounding world suddenly feels strangely distant, that's not disconnection, it's precision. A kind of soft recalibration begins to hum through perception. Colors feel slightly more saturated. Words carry weight they didn't yesterday. Beneath the surface of ordinary experience, something far older is brushing against the edge of awareness. Not speaking, not teaching, but harmonizing. This isn't knowledge being taught, it's memory being stirred. And honestly, isn't that more unnerving? When the knowing doesn't come from learning, but from a place that feels like it always knew. Something old and deliberate is quietly surveying the terrain, not through eyes or judgment, but through resonance. It moves like a current searching for unlocked doors, and those attuned enough are gently pulled into its radius. This isn't random, and it isn't luck. The pull begins when something internal loosens, an outdated structure within finally too small to contain what's becoming. That unexplained disorientation, the strange shifts in behavior, the flickers of unfamiliar emotion, these aren't malfunctions. They're signs of a system being reconfigured. But here's where it gets strange. This kind of energy doesn't just soothe or elevate, it reorders. It reaches into the mental architecture, rearranging priorities, dissolving assumptions, bending perception until what once felt solid now feels optional. So here's a thought. What if spiritual contact doesn't just inspire, it rewires? And if that's true, what parts of the old framework are already beginning to fade? Some forms of intelligence don't announce themselves with facts or formulas. They arrive uninvited, flowing in like a low-frequency tone that rearranges the space before anyone notices it's there. This isn't about cognitive speed or stored data. It's a different type of knowing altogether. It reveals itself in the pauses between thoughts, in the way language slips out effortlessly and carries more weight than expected. Emotional truths seem to surface in others without being spoken. Patterns begin to shimmer just before they crystallize. Information feels less like discovery and more like remembering something the body never forgot. And strangely, none of it feels forced. It's as if something beneath the surface has taken the wheel, not to replace thought, but to reframe how thought flows. If this kind of perception isn't logical and isn't learned, then what is it? Could it be that the mind doesn't need to think harder to evolve, just clearer, quieter, and closer to its original setting? Sometimes clarity doesn't arrive through analysis. It flickers in like a forgotten lyric suddenly recalled mid-silence. It doesn't sound like a new thought. It feels more like a quiet echo of something that's always been there, waiting for the static to fade. Oddly, reactions begin to shift. Irritations lose their grip. Distractions dissolve into deep attention. This isn't some emotional high or mental trick. It's the nervous system recalibrating to a signal that doesn't shout. What emerges is a kind of knowing that doesn't care about being right, only about being real. It reads the room before a word is spoken. It chooses stillness when most would push. It acts not out of urgency, but alignment. And when days like this slip through the fabric of the usual, they don't just pass, they open. So here's something to sit with. If insight can arrive without effort, what else might be trying to reach the surface unnoticed? If you felt something here, like it was meant just for you, maybe it was. Subscribe. No need to explain it, just stay. Stillness doesn't always arrive without resistance. The closer the internal system drifts toward coherence, the more friction begins to surface. Not loud or chaotic, but quiet and calculated. Like gravity pulling gently at a rocket just before it breaks orbit, there's a force that prefers the familiar over the transformed. Meanwhile, something else entirely is unfolding beneath the noise. A kind of invisible gathering, as if a signal had been sent long before this moment, and those attuned to it are just now beginning to respond. Most won't feel it. For them, today folds into routine without a ripple. But for others, there's a peculiar tension in the air, the sense that the ordinary is hiding something deliberate. It's hard to name, harder to explain, but the awareness is there, a subtle pulse just under the surface, whispering that this day isn't empty, it's encrypted. So the question becomes, when the shift starts whispering, does the mind listen or does habit answer first? If something inside you felt still while watching this, it means you're aligning. Subscribe and stay close, because the transmission continues. What's unfolding now isn't designed to be seen or heard. There are no banners in the sky, no dramatic crescendos. Instead, it's a quiet precision, like gears turning in a machine far beneath the floorboards of perception. Something fundamental is being restructured, not for show, but for significance. This isn't just another date circled by tradition. It's a moment when the scaffolding of identity realigns, subtle, intricate, and entirely internal. Deep within that unseen architecture, a signal marks a checkpoint passed, not consciously remembered, but deeply recognized. It feels less like achievement and more like arrival, like stepping into coordinates long set by an earlier version of the self that knew exactly how this would unfold. Strange how no external acknowledgement is needed to make it real. So ask quietly, just once, what if today is a signature in light, written on timelines the conscious mind forgot, but the soul never did? Some moments don't just echo who one has been, they quietly activate who one already is beneath the surface. This isn't about recall, it's about convergence, like two timelines folding into one another without friction. On a day like this, the gap between essence and identity closes, not with fanfare but with familiarity. No declarations, no visible shift, just a soft clarity, as if some internal compass finally points true without explanation. It might show up as an inexplicable mood at sunrise, numbers repeating without effort, memories returning with uncanny timing. There's no need to chase meaning in it all. The pattern is doing the remembering. And sometimes the strangest sensation isn't being seen by the outside world, but being witnessed by a version of the self that already knows what comes next. So what if the presence felt today isn't a return to the past, but a moment where the future arrives early, just to say, welcome back? This kind of current doesn't rush through crowds or flash itself in spectacle. It hums quietly, precisely, for those receptive enough to notice the shift. And once that resonance is felt, once the inner circuitry begins to settle into something coherent, a counterforce often stirs, not out of malice, but design. There's a pattern here, one that few speak about. As clarity sharpens, so does the shadow. Resistance doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it slips in through familiar thoughts, softened temptations, or subtle hesitations that seem harmless. That's how it adjusts, by studying what no longer works and replacing it with silence disguised as comfort. Strange, isn't it? The closer one gets to alignment, the more sophisticated the static becomes. So perhaps the real question isn't how to reach clarity, but how to hold it when the very air begins to shift against it. And right now, somewhere beneath the surface of ordinary life, that shift is already preparing its next move, Can it be felt yet? What's coming next might just be the missing piece you didn't know you were looking for. Hit subscribe, because the next message wasn't meant to be missed. Sometimes resistance doesn't storm the gates. It slips through the cracks wearing the clothes of comfort. It doesn't demand attention with fire. It settles in like fog, dulling the edges of clarity just enough to feel like nothing's wrong. Plans lose momentum, focus fragments. An impulse to act is followed by a strange stillness, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that numbs. It might feel like random fatigue, harmless scrolling, or thoughts looping in perfectly rational ways that somehow go nowhere. What once sparked inner movement now seems muted, irrelevant, even inconvenient. But that's the trick. Resistance isn't trying to destroy anything. It's trying to dilute purpose until nothing feels worth following through. Isn't that clever? It won't shout to stop the path forward. It'll whisper just enough to forget there was one. There's an increasing ability to perceive what's not being said, to read between the micro-expressions, the hesitations, the softened tones. It's subtle, but unmistakable. A shift from reacting to observing, from absorbing noise to decoding essence. And interestingly, this refinement tends to surface in those who've spent most of life blending into the edges, those once labeled too sensitive, too hesitant, too quiet to lead. Yet now those very qualities have become instruments of precision. The outer world may still glorify volume, but beneath it, something quieter is taking shape. There's a kind of awareness rising, steady, understated, nearly invisible, that doesn't compete for space, but owns it effortlessly. Isn't it strange how the most silent observers are now becoming the clearest mirrors? What once felt like being out of sync was never disconnection. It was early calibration. Traits once mistaken for weakness, quietness, intensity, inwardness, are now emerging as signal clarity. The stillness that used to seem passive has turned directional, like sonar reading deeper into the atmosphere of others. Conversations pause midstream, not out of awkwardness, but because something unspoken is already being understood. The nervous system isn't just sensing, it's translating. This isn't about emotional sensitivity anymore. It's the emergence of refined internal signal processing, and with that shift, the appetite for performance fades. Words still exist, but they're no longer needed to prove presence. Expression begins to sound more like resonance and less like effort. The need to be heard gives way to the reality of being felt. So maybe the question is no longer, can this be said? But is this already known without sound? And isn't that a different kind of power? This isn't absence, it's presence at its most refined. Not the kind that needs to prove itself, but the kind that quietly shapes the space around it. The more awareness deepens, the less explanation is needed. Words lose their urgency when stillness begins to speak in subtler codes. And here's the quiet truth that often goes unnoticed. The more attuned the internal field becomes, the more reality begins to organize itself in response. There's no need to overtake the room when the frequency itself does the work. What once was silence born of uncertainty has evolved into quiet rooted in certainty. That quiet doesn't disappear, it radiates. It's not the absence of sound, it's the full expression of alignment without interruption. And perhaps the most telling shift of all is this. There's no longer a door to knock on, no threshold to seek. The threshold is already crossed. The key isn't in hand, it is the hand. So now the question becomes, what happens when the one who used to wait for the shift becomes the shift itself? If this message found its way to you and you're still here, thank you for holding space with me. If the content resonated, feel free to subscribe and stay connected as more reflections unfold. Your presence here genuinely matters. And if anything stirred within, an insight, a feeling, a memory, drop it in the comments. Sometimes one sentence from someone else becomes the exact signal someone else needed. Until next time, stay grounded, stay curious, and if it feels aligned, subscribe to keep journeying deeper with us.